welcome. Together with my assistants Tamara and Mitchell, I have selected some of your questions and I will now try to give an answer. First of all, I already apologize for the way in which I may pronounce your names, because some of your names are totally new for me and I don't know actually how to correctly pronounce them, so I beg your pardon. We start with a very nice question from Rachel about Basel II and Basel III. The question of Rachel is the following. To what extent do the course coordinators feel like the general principles of Basel II and III were and are followed in practice? So, officially, the principles of Basel II and Basel III were and are followed. In practice, as you can imagine, it may happen that there is a difference between the principle and the actual implementation of things. For example, my personal idea is that especially at the very beginning of Basel II, there was a lot of improvisation because people were not aware of all these new statistical tools they had to use, and they started using these tools without really knowing what they were doing. And it may seem strange that top risk managers are not aware of what they are doing, but it may happen more often than what you think. And for example, we will see in week 3 that one of the queen measures for risk management, that is to say value at risk, is a measure that has a lot of weaknesses, and most of the times both officially and unofficially these weaknesses were ignored. So you will see during this course that there is somehow a difference between the principles of the Basel framework that are totally correct, and I would say that no one could disagree about those principles, and the way in which they are really implemented, because you always have to think about the fact that a bank, a company, is not a self-existent entity. It's just an organization involving people, involving human beings. And when you deal with human beings, you always have to keep in mind that there are ambitions, that there is greed, then there is the desire of power. So there is a quite important difference between theory and practice. Okay, now we have another question. There was no name for that question, and is the following. Does Basel II only affect banks? Are companies immune? Obviously the answer is no. So companies, even if they are not banks, are affected by Basel II and Basel III, both directly and indirectly. So if you are a company and you go to a bank and you want to borrow some money from the bank, obviously you are subject to the credit evaluation of the bank. So the banks will assess your credit worthiness using the rules that are imposed by the Basel framework. So in that case you are obviously subject to the Basel framework. But if you are a company and your shares are traded on the market, or you are issuing bonds, in that case again you are subject to the Basel framework. So if you ask me if the small ice cream shop at the corner is subject to Basel directly in the assessment of the credit worthiness or in assessing the risk of its suppliers and vendors, I would say no. But even the small ice cream shop at the corner is subject to Basel II, at least indirectly. Okay? Then we have an interesting question from Edward. Edward asks how does one manage the risk of unknown scenarios? This is a very good point. So all the techniques we will see together, and in general all the techniques you may use in risk management, rely on one strong assumption. That is to say that you can always quantify the probability of an event. It can be a very, very small probability, almost zero, but the idea is that you can always quantify that probability, that you can always express a probability belief about an event. Now, what happens if you cannot express that probability? Then you enter in a field that economists call Knightian uncertainty, from the name of Frank Knight. And that is to say, you are in the field in which there are scenarios you are not even able to imagine, or that you cannot take into consideration in your actual assessment of risk. There is one single example I always like to make to my students at TU Delft, and it's the following. Assume I go to a bank and I ask for a mortgage. Obviously, the bank will assess my credit worthiness using the techniques they want, even the most advanced one, but in saying yes or no to my request, they will never take into account a scenario which is possible, that in theory we can quantify, but which is totally irrelevant, at least in the everyday life, to the situation. That is to say, the fact that an asteroid will hit our planet and destroy everything. So this event will never be taken into consideration in the risk assessment of me asking money to a bank. And in that case, this is an event that in theory we can quantify. But there are also occasions in which there are events we cannot quantify. For example, think about someone asking for money in the 60s, in the 70s, and for example for a long-term loan. Would you have expected something like the web, like internet? That is to say, the infrastructure that is allowing you to watch me speaking on my sofa? No. So for example, there are many scenarios that can come up from science, from research, that we cannot even imagine at this very moment. So we are not able to say what will happen in 30, 40 years. So in that case, we cannot do anything. There are situations in which risk cannot be expressed, cannot be quantified, because we cannot express any belief about the probability of a given event. In that situation, we can just rely on common sense, on intuition, if you have intuition about the possibility of an event, but you cannot get a number for that. And so this is very important because it allows us to understand that in order to be a very good risk manager, you surely need knowledge. You must be able to compute very often the most cumbersome quantities. You must be able to give an interpretation to these numbers. You must know the points of strength and the point of weakness of these numbers. But you also need to be humble. You also need to know that these numbers are not the truth, are not God. In the best situation, they are a sufficient approximation of the truth. But you always have to keep in mind that bad things can happen and you cannot completely sterilize risk. The last thing I would like to add about this topic for the moment is that most of the techniques we use also rely on another assumption, that is to say that the past is a good predictor of the future, that is to say that what we have observed so far is a good approximation of what we will experience in the future. Okay, this is not completely true, because what we have observed in the past can surely happen again in the future, but we can also have events that were not observed in the past and that will happen in the future. So also in that case, when you are making economic forecasting, you always have to consider that the past can give you somehow an idea of the future, but the past does not contain all information about the future. And there is a very strong discussion among scholars and practitioners with respect to this fact, that is to say that the past is not an optimal predictor for the future. But we will be again on this topic later on in the course. Then there is a question of Xenu about emotional risk. And in speaking about emotional risk, Xenu refers to the tendency of people to put money in the system at good times and withdraw it at bad times. Okay, what Xenu calls emotional risk is also known as herding behavior in finance. The idea is that when you consider all investors, the great majority of investors, and I'm speaking about small investors, not large institutional investors, banks and so on, but think about me, think about any other small investor. Very often what is observed on the market is that these investors behave like sheep, meaning that it's like they move in herds. The idea is that they just go on the market and they watch at the behavior of large investors. If the large investors sell, they sell. If they buy, they buy. So essentially they copy most of the time the behavior of the others. Now, this effect is not taken into consideration directly and officially in the Basel framework because it's very difficult to quantify such a behavior. Nevertheless, in the most advanced approaches, for example, in some models belonging to the advanced IRB, there is the idea of taking at least partially into consideration these effects. And this is due to some results that come from an entire field of finance, which is called behavioral finance, which is that part of finance that deals with the modeling and the understanding of the way in which people behave on the market. So this is another possibility to stress the importance of using more advanced approach, more realistic approaches that do not rely just on the computation of sterile, simple mechanical formulas. There is another question which is rather technical from Hegrath. Hegrath asks about the impact of inflation on credit risk. Now, for what concerns the impact of inflation on credit risk, the answer is twofold. From one side, we have that inflation reduces credit risk. Why? Because inflation reduces the value of the outstanding debt. And obviously, this is something positive for the obligor. And reducing the value of the outstanding debt, obviously, for the obligor, reduces the probability of default. At the same time, the most recent econometric literature shows that inflation and to be more precise, inflation volatility and excessive inflation have a rather non-trivial impact on credit spreads. And obviously this increases credit risk. But in order to go into detail about that, we first need to introduce credit spreads. So I just ask for your patience. When we will see credit spreads, we will discuss this in more detail. Then we have another question that has been asked by many of you in different forms and that we have summarized as follows. A lot of countries have a system in which it is very easy for students to borrow money from the government to pay for their education. Students do not have to offer any pledge for this loan. How can the state be sure to get that money back? Okay, so the state cannot be sure about the possibility of getting its money back, and this is simply given by the fact that you can never be sure about the possibility of getting your money back, because in real life certainty does not exist. So you can lend your money to a AAA company, you can lend your money to a AAA country. The probability of default, the probability of losing money will be extremely low, very close to zero, but there is always a very small probability of default and probability of losing money. But apart from that, here the perspective is different. When the government is doing something like that, so it is given the opportunity to a student to lend money at very convenient rates and essentially with no pledge, is doing that not to get the money back, but because it's investing in education, because they think that having educated people is very important for the economy, it's very important for the society, it's very important for the country. So in that case, the mere economic evaluations are on a lower level with respect to higher order ideals. That is, for example, the opportunity of giving education to people. Okay, so in that case, is not really considering the possibility of getting money what moves the government in allowing students to get money, not for free, but at very convenient rates and almost with no pledge. It's not completely true, because obviously that changes from country to country. In some countries, for example, the student has to provide some sort of pledge, for example, through the income or the properties of parents and so on. Okay, so that was for this week. I kindly ask you to keep on posting your questions. You will see that sometimes I answer directly with a short post, or my assistants answer with a short post to your questions. Other times I see that some of your colleagues answer to your questions. If the answer is correct, there is no need of adding my answer. If you really want your answer to be picked, because you can see that there are thousands of questions, just try to be noticed. Okay, so see you next time. Goodbye.